Hey everybody, Mr. Grove here. Today we're going to talk about anaerobic respiration. And so anaerobic respiration is going to be without oxygen. Under normal respiration, oxygen is a big part of that, and the efficiency of getting those 38 to 40 ATP out of a glucose molecule really depends on oxygen and the use of the mitochondria in the Krebs cycle and electron transport chain. So what leaves us with in cellular respiration, if we don't have oxygen, is basically just glycolysis. And so we're down to about 2% efficiency of just getting those 2 ATP out of the glucose molecule. But for some organisms, that's really all that they have to be able to do. And so we have utilized that in a couple of different kinds of fermentation, both alcoholic and lactic acid fermentation, and for cells that have either run out of oxygen or the mitochondria has been damaged, it allows them to continue to survive. So I would definitely encourage you, if you haven't already done so, to go back and look at our video on cellular respiration, how it should normally proceed, and then this video then should make a little bit more sense to you. So let's talk about fermentation. It's really only the glycolysis part, and it's so pretty inefficient. And things that can do this would be like bacteria cells. Some bacteria can do that. Yeast is able to do anaerobic respiration. And even your cells, like your muscle cells, once they run out of oxygen due to vigorous exercise, will then continue on in lactic acid fermentation. So let's talk alcoholic fermentation first. So we start off with glucose, and through the process of glycolysis, we're going to make those 2 ATP, and then we're also going to make those 2 NADHs. And then the product then is 2 3-carbon pyruvates. And so that's where our 6 carbons are that came from the 6 carbons of glucose. But then through the process of fermentation, the yeast or bacteria would take this pyruvate and through an enzyme process recycle that NADH back to the empty version of NAD+, which makes that ready to be used again back over here in glycolysis. And that also cuts off one of the carbon dioxides from each pyruvate, or a carbon, so that they'll be released in the form of carbon dioxide. And so what we're left with is 2 carbon molecules that are going to be ethanol. And so this is the alcohol part of the alcoholic fermentation. And so the carbon dioxide is also produced, and that's why the process of making beer is very foamy, or champagne. There's a lot of carbonation that is provided from that. So one of my friends, he would try and make his own beer, and he got like a little microbrew kit online. And so he had put his bucket in his basement and had sealed the top too tight. And so basically the carbon dioxide just built up in that bucket, and eventually it blew the top off the seal, the lid, and basically his entire basement smelled like beer for quite a while as it just kind of exploded over everywhere. But that is the process of alcoholic fermentation in general. Now, lactic acid fermentation is going to be done by, like I said, your muscles, and bacteria can also do this. And so this is the process of making like cheese or yogurt, and then also your muscle soreness comes from lactic acid fermentation. So it's that same glucose, 6 carbons, and it goes through glycolysis. So we're making 2 ATP, we're making our NADH, and we're making our 2 pyruvates. And then the fermenting organism then can take that NADH and recycle that back to NAD+. But in this case, we're making a molecule called lactate. So lactate and lactic acid are basically the molecule and the ionized molecule. And so this lactate then is also a 3-carbon. So we did not produce any carbon dioxide like what we did over here on the alcoholic fermentation. And so this is the muscle soreness. So if you're running, doing some sort of long-term physical activity, your cells use up all the oxygen that is stored in the cells. Your body tries to compensate by breathing harder and trying to take in more oxygen, but it's just a losing battle. And so eventually your cells will switch over to lactic acid fermentation to where they're still producing ATP, but this lactic acid or lactate also causes really bad muscle soreness. And so that's where your cramping comes in, and eventually then that soreness. So after that real physical activity, the next day, you're really, really feeling it. So what are the ways that top athletes try and overcome this? Like a Michael Phelps, as soon as he got done swimming in a competition, he went straight into another cool-down pool, and he would do more laps swimming. So continuing to just exercise at a lower level, and that helps burn that lactic acid out of your cells. Sometimes in like football games, you'll see players on the sidelines that are riding like a stationary bike, and that's just to keep those muscles going at a low level, so that helps burn that lactic acid out. And top athletes, that's oftentimes what separates them from their competition, is their body's ability to get rid of lactic acid and to produce less lactic acid. And so that's lactic acid fermentation. Now, as we move on into some specifics, so alcoholic fermentation, we're going to look at 4 videos that talk about making of various types of alcohols. And so this has been going on for a long, long, long time. And it's a major, major, major money factor for a lot of companies like Budweiser and Jack Daniels and things like that. And governments have throughout history taxed alcohol and have acquired a lot of tax dollars through the process of alcohol. So this is definitely something, this concept of alcoholic fermentation as a science is definitely something that is a major part of our economy and our history. And so that is alcoholic fermentation. Specifically, we'll kind of talk a little bit about Budweiser, since we're in the St. Louis area, and Budweiser has always been a major company in our region. And so the making of that requires several products, and so we have to have barley, a water source, sugars, and hops. And so hops are a really unique plant. We've grown hops at our house for a couple times just to try and see what it was like, and they produce these little pods here, and that is kind of what's known as the spice of the beer. So different hops will be produced by, will give different flavors to the beer. So I am told. I actually have never drank, and so probably not the most qualified to tell you about the flavors of those, but I can tell you about the science. And so these hops plants are really, really tall. The one at our house gets about 8 to 10 feet tall every year, and it's just this long viney plant, and it produces these little pods then, and those can be dried and added to that. The barley gets toasted then, and we know grains are a source of carbohydrates and sugars, and that toasted barley then provides the sugars in addition to the water and to the yeast. And so Budweiser then uses the same strand of yeast that they've used for many, many years, over 150 years, to produce then their product, the beer that they make. And so that is basically the production of beer and how a company like Budweiser has done that. And you get into some really interesting things, like how does a company that makes beer survive when it's illegal to make beer, like in Prohibition days? And so they had to shift their focus and do baking goods and things like that. And so ultimately, Prohibition was lifted and they were able to come back and make more beer and make more money. So in our videos that are upcoming, you're going to be watching some videos on the production of various types of alcoholic products, beer, moonshine, whiskey, and wine. I want you to pay careful attention as to how what organism is doing the fermentation, and then what sugars are the fermentation source, and then what is the amount of alcohol that is being produced. And we can't really fool ourselves. If we go back to this page here, alcohol is a poison. So if you are drinking alcohol, you are putting a poison in your body. And if you put too much poison in your body, you will die. People die from blood alcohol poisoning every year. And so our government has kind of legal limits on how much alcohol can be put in beverages, and we have legal limits on how much we want you to consume. And so that's why there's driving limits in addition to other alcohol-related laws. So it is something to be very, very careful about. So pay attention to that. Also then pay attention to the lactic acid production. So we're going to see how yogurt is made. And we want you to make sure you're paying attention as to what organism is doing that, and just kind of contrast how making yogurt is going to be different than making the alcohol. So that's a little bit about anaerobic respiration, and hopefully after watching those videos that can be helpful.